An everyday ballgame turns into a moment no one could have predicted when a simple act of disrespect sparks something far bigger. You won't believe how quickly the crowd's attitude changes when the truth finally comes out. Let us know in the comments section below how you would have reacted. Chad Myers shifted his weight lazily in the cramped stadium seat, tapping his sneakers against the metal bar in front of him. His fingers drummed along the armrests, both of which he had commandeered without a second thought. He had gotten the seats early, waited in line, paid good money. He figured he was entitled to stretch out a little, even if that meant bleeding over into the next seat, especially when the next seat was now occupied by some old dude who looked like he had wandered in from a VFW hall. Brandon Poulter adjusted the brim of his faded ball cap, the fabric worn thin from years of being pulled down against the sun. In his left hand he clutched a small, creased ticket stub, like it meant the world. His right hand, shaky but determined, gripped the armrest, the one Chad now leaned against with the full weight of his torso. Brandon cleared his throat softly. "Excuse me," Brandon said, his voice low but firm. "You're leaning into my seat." Chad didn't even glance over. He just chuckled, tossing a handful of peanuts into his mouth and speaking through the crunch. "Yeah, it's a tight fit, Grandpa. Just enjoy the game." Brandon's eyes stayed steady, calm, patient, like someone used to weathering storms far worse than an arrogant young man. He could have pressed it, could have called an usher, caused a scene, but that wasn't his way. Not yet. In the row behind them, the few fans shifted uncomfortably, whispering to each other. A father with his son gave Chad a hard stare but said nothing. A woman in a navy blue jersey pulled her sunglasses down to better watch the brewing confrontation. Still, the noise of the game washed over them. The crack of a bat, the roar of the crowd, the announcer booming through the loudspeakers, drowning out the tension in their little corner. Brandon adjusted himself slightly, trying not to crowd Chad back. His knees ached. Standing long periods was out of the question. He deserved this seat, had paid for it just like anyone else, but more than that, he needed it. Needed to sit for reasons that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with the invisible battles fought across oceans and deserts. Battles that still carved pain deep into the marrow of his bones. Chad shot him a sidewise smirk. "Tell you what, old-timer," he said, grinning wide. "I'll move if you can tell me the last time this team won a World Series." A few people chuckled nearby. Brandon said nothing. He just offered a small smile, the kind that didn't reach his eyes. He pulled the brim of his cap lower, casting a shadow across his lined face. Down by the field, the players switched sides and the stadium burst into a fresh roar. Vendors pushed through the aisles shouting about hot dogs and beer. The game went on, oblivious to the small injustice playing out in Section 114, Row 8. Evan Cooper, seated a few rows up, caught the tail end of the exchange. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, watching carefully. Something about the old man's posture, respectful, dignified, sparked something inside Evan, something familiar, something he hadn't felt in a long time. Evan shifted in his seat and nudged the woman next to him. "You see what's going on down there?" he asked. She nodded grimly. "That kid's being a real piece of work." Beggars stared a little longer, then leaned back, thoughtful. He wasn't one to jump into strangers' business, not unless he had a damn good reason. The fourth inning dragged on. Chad continued to sprawl, his elbows wider now, his sneakers nudging closer to Brandon's carefully placed feet. Brandon endured it silently, watching the game, clapping politely at good plays, wincing when the home team missed easy outs. Through it all, his demeanor never cracked. He radiated a kind of patience that didn't seem to belong to this noisy, impatient world. Finally, during a pitching change, Brandon leaned over slightly. "Son," he said in a voice like gravel and river stones, "you might want to think about what you're doing." Chad turned fully now, both eyebrows raised in mock outrage. "Well, yeah. And why's that?" Brandon met his eyes. There was no anger there, no heat, just a kind of vast, immovable sadness. No reason? Brandon said quietly. Not yet. The words hung in the air longer than they should have. Chad snorted, clearly unimpressed, and turned back to his phone. The woman in the navy jersey leaned over to her husband. "He's too proud to call security," she whispered. "I can tell." Down at field level, a ripple of chatter moved through the lower stands. A few glances darted up toward Brandon. Small ones at first, then larger, like a tide beginning to turn. Pittman Cooper stood slowly, his eyes locked on Brandon now, brow furrowed deep in thought. "Hey," he said to the usher walking by, "you might want to check that situation down there." The usher, a young man in his 20s, followed Eben's gaze, his face tightening when he spotted Chad practically taking over 2 seats, his arrogance on full display. But when he looked at Brandon, at the quiet, reserved old man in the battered cap, something clicked. He tapped his radio and muttered something. Minutes later, a pair of stadium supervisors in sharp polos and headsets appeared at the end of the row, squinting up toward Brandon and Chad. They hesitated, consulted briefly, then started walking up. The game continued, but the energy around Section 1014 was shifting. People were nudging each other, pointing, whispering. Something was happening. Chad finally noticed the supervisors coming and straightened up, annoyed. "Seriously?" he muttered under his breath. "You're really going to make a big deal out of this?" Brandon just sat there, hands folded in his lap, waiting. The supervisors stopped beside the row, glanced from Chad to Brandon, and then back again. "Sir," one of them said carefully, addressing Chad, "we're going to need you to make sure you're within your assigned seat." Chad threw up his hands. "He's got plenty of space. Look at him." More eyes were watching now. The crowd around them fell into a strange, expectant hush. The second supervisor bent slightly toward Brandon. "Sir," he said, with a new kind of deference, "would you mind coming with us for just a moment?" Brandon hesitated, then nodded slowly. He gripped the seat in front of him, pulling himself up with visible effort. As he stood, his jacket shifted slightly, revealing the bronze and green glint of a medal pinned to his chest just below his heart. And that's when the dam broke. A murmur rolled through the crowd like a thunderclap. Someone gasped. Someone else whispered, "Oh my God, that's—" But whatever they said next was lost in the roar that started to build, slow and steady, like a rising tide. And Chad Myers, for the first time all afternoon, looked around and realized he wasn't just being watched. He was being judged. Chad shifted uncomfortably in his seat, aware now of the sudden change in atmosphere. It was subtle at first, like a low hum vibrating through the rows of plastic chairs and concrete steps. Then it grew heavier, weighted by hundreds of unseen stares, invisible fingers of judgment poking at his chest. Chad straightened up, brushing off imaginary lint from his jersey, trying to ignore the burn of eyes all around him. Brandon Poulter moved slowly down the row, each step deliberate and stiff. A supervisor hovered close, not in a hurry, allowing Brandon the dignity of setting his own pace. When Brandon paused for a second to catch his breath, a little girl seated near the aisle stood and clapped quietly. Her father, after a short glance at Brandon's chest and that glinting medal, rose too, clapping solemnly. It spread like a fever. 2 people, then 4, then dozens. Brandon didn't react. His eyes remained forward, determined but detached, as if he were walking a familiar battlefield. Up in the media box, Tom Reynolds caught sight of the commotion on one of the monitors. He leaned closer to the screen, frowning, his finger hovering over the microphone's mute button. "Hold on," he said to his fellow commentator. "Something's happening down in Section 114. Tom squinted, adjusting the focus, catching a glimpse of the slow-moving figure flanked by stadium staff and a rising crowd of clapping fans. "You recognize him?" his co-host asked, sipping from a coffee mug adorned with the team's logo. Tom hesitated. There was something about that face, something carved from stone and memory. "No," Tom said carefully, "but I have a feeling we should—" Down in the stands, Chad watched Brandon shuffle down the steps and felt a tight knot forming in his chest. What the hell was going on? Why were people clapping for the old man? This was supposed to be his seat, his game, his Saturday. He hadn't done anything wrong. The usher who had approached earlier remained nearby, offering no words, just watching Chad with a neutral expression that somehow made Chad feel worse than if he had been outright cursed. Chad ran a hand through his hair, suddenly feeling too warm, too exposed. Brandon reached the bottom of the section where the supervisor gestured toward a small private area, a few rows reserved for special guests. It had better access for those with mobility issues, wider chairs, and a view unobstructed by the constant shuffle of standing fans. Brandon nodded once and allowed himself to be guided there, his ticket already upgraded without a single request uttered. Near the dugouts, players shifted on their cleats, craning their necks toward the rising buzz from the stands. Even the umpire seemed distracted, momentarily delaying the next pitch. Evan Cooper had come down now, threading through the fans who were murmuring louder by the minute. "You know who that is?" he asked a nearby security guard. The guard shook his head. "No clue, but see that?" He pointed discreetly at Brandon's jacket where the edge of the metal still gleamed under the stadium lights. "That's no ordinary souvenir." Evan leaned in, trying to get a better look. His heart jumped in his chest. It was a silver star, a medal awarded for gallantry in action against an enemy of the United States. Evan had only ever seen one other in person, pinned to the chest of a man he'd served under in Afghanistan, a man who had single-handedly carried 3 wounded soldiers through enemy fire. Evan's voice caught in his throat. He stepped forward, catching the supervisor's attention. They exchanged quick words, quiet but urgent. Then Evan approached Brandon, his steps careful, respectful. "Sir," Evan said, his voice low, "I'm Evan Cooper, served Navy Corpsman, 2nd Marine Division." Brandon turned his head slightly, offering Evan the smallest flicker of a smile. Brandon Poulter," he said. "Army, 1st Cavalry." Evan reached out his hand. Brandon took it with a firm grip that belied the tremble in his bones. "Sir," Evan said, his throat tightening, "it's an honor." Brandon just nodded, not a man of wasted words. Above them, Tom Reynolds finally clicked his microphone back on, voice low and reverent as he spoke to thousands listening across radios, TVs, and streaming services. "Folks," he said, "we're witnessing something special today. If you're near Section 114, you might want to stand and show your respect. That's Mr. Brandon Poulter down there, recipient of the Silver Star, Vietnam veteran." The crowd didn't need more. The ripple turned to a wave. All around the stadium, people rose to their feet. A full standing ovation. No music prompted it, no announcer demanded it. It just happened, organic and powerful, like a heartbeat shared by 20,000 strangers at once. Chad shrank into his seat, cheeks burning. He felt the eyes again, heavier now, burning with an intensity that made him want to slide right under his chair and disappear. He wasn't just some guy being a little rude anymore. He was the guy who hadn't given up his seat to a hero. He turned his face toward the field, pretending to be engrossed in the game, but the shame clung to him like a second skin. Brandon stood for a moment, one hand lightly resting on the railing in front of him. His shoulders, bent slightly by time, seemed to straighten just a little under the roaring tide of applause. For the first time that afternoon, his smile cracked wider. Still small, still modest, but real. Evan stood beside him, clapping, and soon security staff joined in too. Kids waved foam fingers. Old men in baseball caps pressed hands to their chests. A woman wiped tears from her eyes with a crumpled napkin. No one rushed Brandon, no one overwhelmed him. They just stood together, filling the air with their gratitude. On the field, the pitcher paused, pulling his cap from his head and holding it over his heart. The batter followed suit. Even the umpire took a step back, lifting his mask and lowering his head. The entire stadium was frozen in that perfect moment, One man's quiet sacrifice meeting 1,000 voices of thanks. Back at his seat, Chad swallowed hard. He thought about slipping away, about disappearing into the crowd and forgetting the whole thing. But something inside gnawed at him, something that whispered maybe he needed to sit right there, to face it, to feel every second of the discomfort he had earned. Brandon finally sat down in his new seat, sighing gently as he settled in. He adjusted his cap once more and leaned back, finally able to enjoy the game. The applause didn't die away all at once. It faded slowly, respectfully, like a tide retreating after it had kissed the shore. And when it was over, when the crack of the bat and the roar of the game resumed, the entire stadium somehow felt different. Because today they'd remembered something bigger than baseball. Chad Myers slouched lower in his seat, arms folded across his chest like a petulant child who knew he had been caught. Around him the energy hadn't just shifted, it had evolved. He could feel the electricity buzzing along the backs of the chairs, the occasional side eye flickering his way, even if most people didn't outright stare anymore. They didn't have to. Chad could feel their disappointment hanging in the air, heavier than the humid summer evening creeping over the stadium. A group of teenagers 2 rows down whispered among themselves, tossing glances backward now and then. Chad caught snippets. "That guy didn't move for him." And, "Can you believe it?" The words weren't angry. Worse, they were filled with disbelief, the kind that sank into your skin and stayed there. Meanwhile, Brandon Poulter sat peacefully in his upgraded seat, a world away from Chad now, figuratively and literally. Evan Cooper remained beside him, occasionally chatting, but mostly just serving as a silent shield between Brandon and the increasingly curious crowd. Brandon wasn't seeking attention, that was obvious. If anything, he seemed slightly embarrassed by the wave of gratitude that had overtaken the stadium. He crossed softly at big plays, smiled at young kids who shyly waved at him, but mostly he kept his gaze fixed steadily on the field, as if it were an old friend he hadn't seen in years. Tom Reynolds, up in the broadcast booth, returned to commentary after the brief interruption. His voice, however, was softer now, less animated, as if the weight of what had happened still rested on his shoulders. "If you're just joining us, ladies and gentlemen," Tom said, "you're probably wondering why there was such a powerful standing ovation here at the ballpark. That was for Brandon Poulter, a Vietnam veteran and Silver Star recipient. Moments like these remind us there's a lot more to life than a scoreboard." In the press box, media personnel scrambled. Cameras zoomed in on Brandon discreetly, trying not to make a spectacle but understanding the gravity of the moment. Reporters from local outlets fired off tweets and news blurbs. By the time the 6th inning began, Brandon's name was trending locally. Photos, grainy but heartfelt, flooded social media. An old man in a worn cap, a glint of a medal catching the setting sun, a stadium of people standing in silent honor. Chad knew it. He knew it without pulling out his phone. He had become part of the story, too, in all the worst ways. He shifted again, trying to focus on the game, but his mind kept replaying that first moment when Brandon had asked, politely, quietly, for the space he was entitled to, and how Chad had laughed it off. The self-satisfaction he'd felt, the smugness, it all now felt like acid bubbling in his gut. Brandon, on the other hand, seemed untouched by it all. If he noticed the cameras or the subtle crowd buzz, he didn't let it show. His focus stayed rooted in the here and now, in the pure, simple joy of a baseball game. Every so often a fan would approach quietly, an older man, a father with a son, a teenager clutching a cap, and offer a quiet thank you. Brandon accepted each one the same way. A brief handshake, a nod, a smile that was full of grace and humility but not seeking applause. In the concourse, a conversation was unfolding between Becky Lawson, the stadium security manager, and 2 of her supervisors. "You see the kid who started this mess?" Becky asked, glancing at a tablet screen showing the surveillance feed. "Row H, section 114. Guy in the white jersey," one of the supervisors said. Becky sighed. She wasn't the type to go picking fights, but sometimes situations demanded acknowledgement. "Make sure he stays put. No need to escalate," she said. "But if he causes any more trouble, I want to be the first to know." Meanwhile, back in the stands, Evan Cooper finally spoke. "You know," he said, voice casual as he nudged Brandon gently with his elbow, "I bet if they knew everything, they'd be even louder." Brandon chuckled under his breath. "They've heard enough." Evan shook his head. "Nah, not even close." He leaned back, letting the setting sun warm his face for a moment before adding, "They don't know about landing zone X-ray, do they?" Brandon's smile faded just a little, touched with the shadow of old memories. "You were there, weren't you?" Evan asked softly. Brandon nodded, almost imperceptibly. His mind drifted, unbidden, to that jungle so many years ago. The smoke, the heat, the deafening chaos of helicopters and shouted commands. His mind filled briefly with names. Names he hadn't spoken aloud in decades. "I wouldn't want to hear about that," Brandon said finally. "They want the hero story, not the rest of it." Evan said nothing. He knew better than to argue. Below them, the batter cracked a line drive into center field, bringing the crowd back to life with cheers and chants. Brandon clapped along, smiling, soaking it all in. In section 1014, Chad sat frozen, feeling the swell of joy around him like a tide he wasn't sure he was allowed to ride. His stomach twisted tighter when a young boy in the row behind him leaned over to his father and said, loud enough for Chad to hear, "Dad, why didn't that guy just move for him? He's a hero." The father didn't answer right away. Then he said quietly, "Sometimes people don't recognize greatness when it's right next to them, son." Chad stared down at his sneakers, wishing they would somehow carry him away from the seat bolted to the ground beneath him. On the field, a foul ball shot into the stands. A high pop fly that drifted lazily toward section 1014. Fans stood, arms reaching skyward. Chad, distracted, didn't move until the ball smacked against the chair beside him and tumbled onto the concrete floor with a dull thunk. The young boy behind him scurried past, snatching it up with a delighted whoop. He turned back toward Brandon instinctively, holding the ball out. "Sir, you want it?" the boy offered, wide-eyed, sincere. Brandon looked startled for a moment, then shook his head kindly. "No, son, that's yours. You earned it." The boy beamed, retreating to his seat, hugging the ball like a treasure. It was such a simple exchange, a boy offering a ball, a man offering a blessing, but Chad felt it slam into him harder than any rebuke ever could have. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, head in his hands. He didn't know how to fix it, didn't know if he even could. But somewhere deep inside something shifted, a crack in the hard outer shell he wore like armor. A small voice whispering that maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to start doing the right thing. Across the stadium, the sun dipped lower, painting the sky in streaks of burnt orange and deep blue. The air smelled of popcorn, grass, and summer sweat, thick with the heat of the day, but somehow sweeter now, too. As the seventh inning stretch approached, a low rumble began to grow, a tradition as old as the game itself. Brandon rose slowly with the rest of the stadium, grimacing a little as his knees protested. Evan offered a hand, steadying him, and together, with 20,000 others, they sang. They sang about peanuts and Cracker Jack and the pure, innocent hope of coming back home after the bottom of the ninth. Chad stood too, stiffly at first. He didn't sing. Not yet. But he stood, and he listened. And very, just maybe, for the first time all day, he really heard. The crowd's chorus faded back into the pulse of the ball game, but something invisible lingered in the air. It wasn't just about the plays anymore, or the home team's chances of winning. It was about the man sitting quietly among them all, and the silent, growing realization of everything he represented. Chad Myers sat stiffly in his seat, arms resting awkwardly at his sides. He wasn't sure what he was supposed to do anymore. Every muscle in his body told him to stand, to walk down and say something, anything, to the man he had slighted. But another voice, quieter and sharper, told him he didn't deserve that chance. Not yet. maybe not ever. Down near the field, Brandon Poulter didn't seem to notice the swirling emotions around him. His focus remained locked on the game, but there was a different energy in his posture now, lighter somehow, less burdened. The respect, the ovations, the countless silent nods of gratitude washing over him, they hadn't gone unnoticed. They had just been received in the way a soldier receives rain after a long march, with quiet, wordless appreciation. In the broadcast booth, Tom Reynolds spoke again, low and thoughtful. "You know, folks," he said, "sometimes the heroes among us aren't the ones charging onto a field or into a headline. Sometimes they're just sitting quietly in seat H12, hoping to watch a ball game in peace." The camera panned once more to Brandon. This time there was no zoom. Just a respectful, lingering shot before fading back to the players. Back near the top of the section, Becky Lawson folded her arms and watched the scene unfold. She knew about people like Brandon. Her father had been one. A quiet man who carried the weight of old battles in the slump of his shoulders, who never spoke about what he'd seen, but whose every action taught her what real strength looked like. She made a note to herself. Something small but important. Brandon Poulter would never pay for another ticket at this stadium again. Meanwhile, Evan Cooper remained a steady presence beside Brandon, answering a few whispered questions from curious fans when it felt appropriate. One teenage boy in a replica jersey asked if he could take a photo with Brandon, and Evan gently declined on his behalf. "Today's about letting him be here," Evan explained, "not putting him on display." The boy seemed to understand, nodding with a solemnity rare for his age, and returned to his seat without argument. Brandon shifted slightly, feeling the dull throb in his hip flare up again. He grimaced, but didn't complain. He'd fought through worse pain than this. 1,000 little reminders of a life lived in service pulsed in his bones, but none were heavy enough to outweigh the pride swelling quietly in his chest. Chad couldn't take it any more. He stood abruptly, earning a few startled glances from those around him. His heart hammered against his ribs as he made his way clumsily down the stairs, each step feeling heavier than the last. He didn't have a plan. He just knew he couldn't sit there any longer and pretend nothing had happened. He stopped at the bottom of the steps, a few feet away from Brandon and Evan. His mouth opened, but the words tangled in his throat, thick and clumsy. Brandon turned his head slightly, his eyes meeting Chad's with a calm, curious gaze. No judgment, no anger. Patience. Chad swallowed hard, wiping his palms on his jeans. "Sir," he started, voice cracking. I'm sorry." The surrounding fans quieted slightly, tuning in without appearing to. Chad's cheeks burned hotter under their gaze, but he forced himself to continue. "I didn't know who you were. I didn't know—" He stopped himself. That wasn't right. It wasn't about knowing. It was about respect. "I should have treated you better," Chas said, his voice stronger now. "You deserved better." Barron said nothing for a moment. Then he nodded once, slow and deliberate. "Thank you," he said simply. Chad exhaled shakily, nodding in return. He stood there a second longer, unsure of what to do, then slowly backed away, finding an empty patch of concrete wall to lean against. He didn't return to his seat right away. Somehow it didn't feel like he had earned that comfort yet. Evan watched the exchange with a small, approving smile. He clapped Brandon gently on the back, a silent acknowledgment of the grace the old veteran had shown yet again. A few fans around them gave quiet nods, not huge, sweeping gestures, just small, simple signs of approval, the kind that mattered more. As the bottom of the 7th inning kicked off, the stadium lights buzzed to full brightness, chasing away the last of the dusky evening sky. Players shouted calls to one another across the field. Vendors pushed carts of popcorn and soda through the aisles. Life at the ballpark marched forward. And yet, Section 114 felt different, like a sacred space had been carved out among the popcorn-strewn concrete and metal chairs, a space where honor had been quietly restored. At one point, Brandon leaned toward Evan and said, almost conspiratorially, I never even liked baseball all that much." Evan barked a surprised laugh, earning a few glances before quickly muffling it. "Then why'd you come today?" he asked, grinning. Brandon shrugged, the smallest twitch of his shoulders. "Seemed like a good place to feel normal," he said. "To remember what we fought for." Evan nodded, feeling his throat tighten again. He turned back to the field, blinking hard. Across the stadium, the energy rippled outward, subtle, unspoken, but powerful, a reminder stitched into every pitch and every cheer that day. Greatness doesn't always wear a cape. Sometimes it wears an old cap, clutches a worn ticket, and asks for nothing more than a little space to breathe. Chad finally returned to his seat, moving more carefully now. His entire demeanor shifted. He sat respectfully within the narrow confines of his assigned chair, no longer sprawling or elbowing. He didn't look around for validation. He didn't expect forgiveness to be public or immediate. But in the small, silent way that mattered, he began trying to earn it. As the innings wore on, Brandon stayed. He could have left early, avoided the post-game crowds and the gauntlet of well-meaning fans who would inevitably try to stop him, but he didn't. He stayed to see the final out, to hear the final roar, to stand alongside strangers who now understood just a little more about the quiet man among them. When the final pitch sailed across the plate and the umpire barked his call, the stadium erupted again, a messy, joyous explosion of sound and movement. Brandon stood carefully, feeling the familiar ache of his joints. Evan offered an arm, but Brandon waved him off gently. "I got this," he said. Together they moved slowly toward the exit, Evan matching Brandon's pace. Around them, a few fans reached out, offering handshakes or simple nods of respect. Nothing overwhelming, nothing invasive. Just enough. As they reached the edge of the concourse, a young woman in a team jersey approached cautiously. "Sir," she said, voice shaking slightly, "thank you for everything." Brandon looked at her, really looked, and then tipped his cap. "You're welcome, young lady." And then, without fanfare or speeches, he turned and disappeared into the flow of the crowd, carried along by the heartbeat of a grateful nation that, at least for today, had remembered. The night air outside the stadium was cooler now, brushing against the crowd in soft, sweeping currents as they flooded into the wide concrete plaza. Families grouped together, vendors shouted last-minute sales, and a few die-hard fans sang off-key team anthems into the gathering darkness. Somewhere in the distance, a lone saxophone played, its notes curling up into the humid night like smoke. It should have been just another evening after just another game. But not tonight. Brandon Poulter moved with steady determination through the press of bodies, Evan Cooper walking a half-step behind him like a silent sentry. Every few paces someone stopped him. A handshake, a brief nod, a respectful murmur. No long conversations, no demands for selfies. Just a current of human gratitude, as natural and quiet as breathing. Chad Myers emerged a few minutes later, trailing behind a small knot of fans. He kept his head low, his ball cap pulled down over his brow, avoiding eye contact where he could. He wasn't ashamed because the crowd made him feel it. He was ashamed because he understood now that he had earned it. The weight of the day bore down on him heavier than any heckles or insults ever could. Near the main exit gates, the stadium's head of guest services, an older woman named Clara Vincent, stood holding a radio to her ear. When she spotted Brandon approaching, she lowered it quickly and hurried to intercept him. "Mr. Poulter," she said, her voice warm but reverent, "if you don't mind, we have a small request." Brandon blinked, wary but polite. Evan leaned in, ready to step between them if needed. "We'd be honored," Clara continued, "if you would join us for a moment down by the field, just a little recognition. No speeches, I promise." Brandon hesitated, glancing at Evan. "You don't have to," Evan said. "Your call." For a second, Brandon almost said no. Every instinct told him to avoid the spotlight, to slip away into the anonymity he had cultivated for decades. But then he thought about the boy who had offered him the foul ball, the father who had explained to his son why respect matters, the thousands who had stood without needing to be asked. Maybe it wasn't about him. Maybe it was about them. He nodded once. Clara smiled in relief and waved toward a small group of security staff who immediately began clearing a path back toward the field. Fans parted like water, many recognizing what was happening and clapping softly as he passed. The applause was quieter now, but somehow more profound, like a sacred hum vibrating through the ground itself. Chad watched from a distance, heart pounding in his ears. He thought about following, about standing close enough to at least bear witness, but something inside told him it wasn't his place, not yet. So he stayed back, hands shoved deep into his pockets, watching the story unfold like a man peering through glass at a world he didn't belong to. Down at field level, the grass gleamed under the floodlights, every blade seeming to stand at attention. The announcer's voice, usually brash and booming, softened as it filled the stadium one more time. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "before you leave tonight, we invite you to take a moment to honor a special guest among us, Mr. Brandon Poulter, United States Army veteran, Silver Star recipient, and American hero." The crowd, those still lingering in the stands, those halfway through the exits, those even outside in the plaza, turned back. Another ovation rose, like a slow-motion wave building across the night. Brandon stood at the edge of the field, his cap clutched in one hand, his other resting lightly on the railing. He didn't raise his arms. He didn't make a speech. He simply bowed his head for a moment, closing his eyes, feeling the hum of 20,000 hearts beating gratitude into the night sky. Evan stood nearby, hands loose at his sides, his own throat tight with emotion. Behind them, the giant stadium screen flickered to life. It didn't show Brandon's military record, or parade clips, or medal ceremonies. It simply displayed a single black and white photo. A young soldier, impossibly young, standing tall in a foreign jungle, with a rifle slung over his shoulder and determination in his eyes. Well, years of service. No need. Everyone knew. Brandon glanced up at the screen and allowed himself a small smile. Not for himself, but for the boy he had once been, and for the countless others who never made it home to see a crowd like this. The ovation rolled on long after the image faded back to black. No one wanted to be the first to stop clapping. No one wanted the moment to end. Finally, Brandon tucked his cap back onto his head, gave a small wave, barely more than a flick of his fingers, and turned away from the field. As he walked slowly back up the tunnel, the fans resumed clapping one last time, a final echo of thanks, following him into the underbelly of the stadium. In the parking lot, Chad lingered near his car, gripping the steering wheel even though he hadn't gotten inside yet. He stared down at the cracked asphalt, wondering how many moments like this he had missed in his life. Too busy, too distracted, too proud to recognize the heroes standing right next to him. A soft voice broke into his thoughts. "You could say something." Chad looked up. Evan Cooper stood a few feet away, arms crossed, watching him steadily. "I tried," Chad said, voice rough. "Try harder," Evan said simply. "Or don't, but don't pretend it doesn't matter." Chad nodded slowly. He wasn't used to people being that direct, but he appreciated it, even if it stung. Across the lot, Brandon Poulter climbed into the passenger seat of an old Ford pickup, Evan's truck, judging by the worn bumper stickers about service and honor. The two men exchanged a few quiet words, then pulled out into the slow-moving stream of cars heading back toward town. Chad watched the tail lights fade into the night, a slow ache blooming deep in his chest. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring. Maybe he'd never get another chance to say the right thing. Maybe this was just one more regret he'd have to carry. But for tonight, he stood still. He bore witness. He learned, and somewhere, deep inside, he made himself a promise. The next time he saw greatness standing beside him, he wouldn't need to be told. He would know, and he would stand. The next morning, the sunlight stretched across the quiet town, spilling gold over rooftops and picket fences, over empty sidewalks and slowly waking neighborhoods. It was the kind of morning that made everything feel new again, like second chances might be hiding just beyond the horizon if you were brave enough to look for them. At a small diner not far from the stadium, the door chimed softly as Brandon Poulter stepped inside. The place smelled like fresh coffee and bacon, and the hum of soft conversation buzzed through the air. Evan Cooper was already there, seated in a corner booth, nursing a black coffee and reading a crumpled newspaper. Brandon made his way over slowly, every step a negotiation with old wounds, but his eyes were clear, steady. Evan looked up, smiled, and slid a mug across the table. "Morning, sir," Evan said. Brandon nodded in greeting and sat down with a small grunt, shrugging off his jacket and folding it neatly beside him. "They're talking about you, you know," Evan said, tapping the front page. Brandon squinted at the bold headline stretched across the paper. "Vietnam veteran honored at stadium after quiet act of courage." He shook his head with a chuckle. "Wasn't much courage in sitting in a chair, was there?" Evan smiled, lifting his coffee in a silent toast. "Sometimes the smallest stands are the biggest ones." They sat for a while without speaking, comfortable in the quiet. Brandon sipped his coffee, staring out the window at the slow roll of the town waking up. For once, he didn't feel like a relic or a stranger. He felt seen, respected, whole. Across town, Chad Myers sat at his kitchen table, an untouched cup of coffee cooling by his elbow. His phone buzzed constantly, texts from friends, notifications from social media. He didn't need to read them to know what they said. He had made his mistake in public, and now he wore it the way a man wears an ill-fitting coat. Heavy, visible. He could have ignored it, let it pass, pretended yesterday had never happened. But as he sat there, staring at the swirling steam rising from his mug, Chad knew he didn't want to run from it. He wanted to be better. Grabbing his jacket, he headed out the door, unsure exactly where his feet would take him, only knowing he needed to move forward. At the stadium, preparations were underway for the next game. Groundskeepers raked the infield dirt, vendors stocked supplies, and a handful of staff members gathered in Section 114 with a clipboard and a new brass plaque. Becky Lawson supervised the installation herself, making sure it was mounted at just the right height, centered perfectly on the seat. The plaque was simple, no grandiose language, just a few words etched deep into the shining surface. "Reserved in honor of Brandon Poulter, a true American hero. Thank you for your service." It wasn't just a gesture. It was a promise. A commitment that his seat would always be waiting for him, and that no one would ever again need to ask for the respect already owed to them. When Brandon and Evan arrived at the stadium later that afternoon, invited back quietly, no cameras this time, Becky met them at the main entrance. She shook Brandon's hand firmly, her grip strong and respectful. "I hope you don't mind," she said, guiding him toward Section 114. "We made a small change." Brandon followed without question, but when he saw the plaque, he stopped in his tracks. For a long moment he said nothing. Evan stood beside him, grinning, his hands jammed into his pockets to keep from clapping Brandon on the back like a proud brother. Brandon traced the edge of the plaque with his fingertips. The metal was cool against his skin, but it warmed quickly under his touch. "You didn't have to do this," he said, his voice low. Becky smiled. "We know. That's why we did." Brandon nodded once, feeling something tighten in his chest. Not sadness, not even pride, just gratitude, pure and humbling, washing through him like a tide. He sat down slowly, easing into the newly dedicated seat, and looked out over the field where kids played catch, where families found their places, where life went on exactly as it should. It wasn't about the seat. It was about the message. "You know, Blah, you are remembered. You are. Across the stadium, Chad Myers hesitated near the entrance. He spotted Brandon almost immediately, the old man seated in his rightful place, framed by the plaque that now bore his name. A few fans stopped to shake Brandon's hand or take a quiet photo of the new memorial, but otherwise the area buzzed with a different energy now, a respectful bubble, an invisible boundary of gratitude. Chad steeled himself and walked toward them. Evan saw him first, his body stiffening slightly, ready to intercept if needed. But something in Chad's face, something raw and sincere, made him pause. Chad approached slowly, stopping a few feet away. "Sir," he said, his voice stronger than it had been yesterday, "I just wanted to say thank you. Not just for yesterday, for everything." Brandon looked up at him, his eyes kind but sharp, measuring the weight of the words. He extended his hand without hesitation. Chad took it, gripping it tightly, feeling the calluses, the strength that still lived there. It was not a handshake of forgiveness, because Brandon had never been angry. It was a handshake of understanding, of reconciliation, of hope. They parted after a moment, and Chad turned, disappearing into the growing crowd, lighter somehow, a little less burdened by the man he had been, a little more inspired by the man he still had time to become. The game that day was ordinary by every statistic. No grand slams, no record-breaking plays. But to those seated near Section 114, it was unforgettable. They watched Brandon Poulter cheer when a double was smacked into left field. They saw him smile as a little girl waved a foam finger twice her size. They witnessed the slow, steady mending of something much bigger than baseball. And when the seventh-inning stretch came, the entire section and slowly the entire stadium rose together. Not just for tradition, not just for the song, but for the man in the seat with the plaque, or Brandon Poulter. And somewhere in that rising sea of fans, amid the clapping and singing and laughter, Chad Myers stood too, a little straighter, a little wiser, a little better. It was just a baseball game. It was everything that mattered. And for the first time in a long time, Brandon Poulter didn't feel like a memory fading from a world that had moved on. He felt alive. He felt honored. He felt home.